Welcome to Lift as We Rise. I am Roshni Gajjar. In a rapidly changed world, health risks have become a hot topic in boardrooms and in leadership circles, simply because compromised health risks impact sustainability of nations, in leadership, and in business. The World Economic Forum's top global risks now include infectious diseases and the livelihood crisis in the top 5 risks by impact, and specifically goes on to list mental health deterioration. These now stand alongside environmental, geopolitical, and cybersecurity risks. This signals a strong call by leaders across the world for committed mitigation strategies to reduce health risks, and to do so, leaders need to have a better understanding of human physiology and its influence on leadership, executive, and professional resilience. I'm speaking today on this topic to Andrew Macdonald after some years in finance and investment leadership. Andrew has become a strong advocate for structured physiology programs in business. Andrew is the founder of PQ Index, and we declare is a business partner to StratAstute Consulting in South Africa. Andrew, thank you for making time to speak with us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Roshni. Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic. Andrew, we know that leaders and top companies want to surround themselves with the best to become successful. We've heard of IQ, which I guess left us all feeling a little bit doubtful of our intelligence at school. And then over the last 20 years, leaders started to get comfortable with this idea of EQ. Some applied it more authentically, and some we've seen a little bit more awkwardly. We're speaking today about PQ. What is PQ? Andrew, can you unpack that for us?
Yes, PQ simply is the physiological quotient. It's a measurable physiological assessment of an individual's performance capability relative to their physical capacity, so their body functions. The human body is multifarious in its capacity, but up until now, executives have not measured it as a contributor to their performance. And PQ was specifically set up to gather together the metrics that could then form the basis of that assessment.
So, Andrew, you were an executive in the financial services industry and investment space for more than 20 years at Merrill Lynch, to be specific, and then turned to executive coaching for the last 16 years. What led you to discover PQ and convert it to a specific business area of focus for yourself?
Right. The history is quite straightforward. As an executive coach, I've always been interested in metric assessment. And so I've used a number of psychometric tools in the past and cognitive tests. I don't think they are a panacea, but they can be quite powerful in engaging individuals in understanding themselves better. Because until we understand ourselves, we can't manage ourselves. So that diagnostic process is important. And it's very clear that the executive market does not have any physiological metrics against which to measure itself. Physiometrics is what we call them. And so I started to look around, and the place that physiometrics are actively used is elite sport. Elite sport is a place where the body is the primary determinant of performance, and so clearly that is where sports science was born. Sports science has become the bedrock of enhanced performance. I'd point out to our audience that the last Olympics, the two outperforming nations in the medal tables were United Kingdom, or Team GB, and Australia. The top 5 universities for sports science in the world are to be found in those two countries. The number 1 for that particular discipline of sports science is Loughborough University, which is in the UK. It's been number 1 for the last 5 years, and that is the university that we're linked to for research. And so we went to Loughborough, and we have spent the last 5 years finessing the process of understanding the metrics and the dynamics that could be brought to bear in the executive world to link to the existing metric framework of assessment and management that is in place. And that's the 3Q environment that ultimately we anticipate will optimize executive performance. But PQ is specifically, and why I was interested in it, was because no one had taken the time to create a metric framework which was usable by executive coaches, by managers, by consultancies to bake into their processes.
Andrew, in your career, throughout your leadership experience, did you ever prioritize PQ for yourself in sustaining your leadership journey?
When I reflect, yes, in a variety of ways. I worked progressively to increase my fitness, which I allowed lagging in my 20s. So in my 30s, I became much more active in managing my physical fitness to build my physical resilience. But I also look at my daily routine when I was a busy executive. I used to walk a lot. I used to walk between meetings. I chose to take a lunchtime walk during my break rather than eating my lunch at my desk. I consciously managed my bedtime around the time I was expecting to wake up to manage the quantum of hourly sleep. So there were already indicators that I was interested in this area. That's been greatly helped in recent years by the advent of a variety of wearable devices that can also help us put some metric framework and understanding of our self-management. Yeah, I think it's demonstrable, and our data is showing that executives by necessity have already tried to take some control of their PQ. They just haven't known it as PQ.
No, Andrew, it always surprises me, certainly throughout my career, that in the sporting space, we see the tangible link between performance, high performance, and these physiological measures and coaching to that end. But yet in a business, corporate / high performance environment where you're required to give 100% most of the time, that link is not that strong and tangible. So perhaps now the time has come, certainly after what we've experienced in the last year, to position something like PQ, and we'll get into that a little bit later. An area of interest that is now coming to the surface, and certainly as a female, I'm interested in hearing more about this. So a recent study by McKinsey showed that approximately 40% of employees in the US are experiencing mental health challenges, more so in the case of female, who carry a higher risk around burnout, and that includes exhaustion and stress. So women seem to be more vulnerable to workplace pressure, and I admit to having experienced this myself throughout my journey. Interestingly, McKinsey goes on to say that 33% of women, 1 in 3 in 2021, have considered what they call downshifting their career or leaving the work this year, compared to 1 in 4 or 25% last year. And if we look at diversity and inclusion strategies where we want to see more female representation amongst other types of diversity inclusion programs, why is this the case with females?
Great question, fundamental question, and there are a variety of elements to this. Funnily enough, I have a meeting next week with a very senior manager at one of our clients who wants to talk about retention because they are seeing a negative correlation between their female executives, their working culture, and retention, particularly around the senior jobs, which is the point that the McKinsey data was indicating. The data that we see, that we measure heart rate variability to find a proxy for stress and recovery in the human body and the function of the autonomic nervous system. The data that we find is that female executives consistently measure higher hours of stress over a 24-hour period. One organization we recently measured, the women had 25% more stress per day over a 7-day period than their male counterparts, and more concerningly, 46% less recovery. Now that's a physiological balance which leads to fatigue, because fatigue, physiological terms, is a surplus of stress relative to recovery designed to wash it out. The pressure performance curve that we work for, the standard Stanford pressure performance curve, demonstrates that after a certain point of surplus stress, the physical response of the body is decline. And that decline is then picked up emotionally. We start behaving in unfamiliar ways. And then ultimately, cognitively, our thought process becomes dysfunctional. But that is preceded and picked up by physiological measures, because the trigger is primarily the response of the body to surplus stress. And women right now are measuring significantly higher levels of stress and lower recovery on average than their male peers. Now, there are a variety of reasons for this, but one, this is why we measure people 24 hours a day and not just in the workplace, is that women bear a greater brunt of caring and taking responsibility for family management than their male counterparts. And this isn't factored into senior management thinking about role descriptions and role redefinition. A senior female executive I spoke to just last week turned down a senior management role because she looked at the person she was replacing and the role description and said, I can't do that. I have 3 young children. I cannot do the sort of travel and working hours that this individual put in. And I feel that is the definition of the role that I've been offered. So it's a physiological response. That will be too much stress. It threatens the status quo of my family. My challenge to organizations is, if you understand that that is the response of your female, and interestingly, the PQ intelligent female executive, why not focus on the objectives of the role rather than defining how it's to be done? And I think a lot of organizations spend too much time telling people how to do their job, rather than saying, this is the outcome we require. How will you do that for us? And is that credible? And I think that switch is going to be fundamental to enabling organizations to offer senior roles that are manageable to female executives who are being more realistic, perhaps, than some of their male counterparts. But, just to give you one shocking statistic, another group of female executives we measured in a pilot group measured 250% more overnight stress, which we can measure scientifically, than their male counterparts. Quite simply, they didn't switch off. Their body was still, it was like leaving the central heating on. They were still sorting out the previous day's issues in their sleep before they could start to relax. And these are real physiological phenomena, and we need to engage with them if we're going to work in a genuinely diverse workforce.
Andrew, that's interesting, but also quite concerning. So you read what the World Economic Forum statistics are showing after the last year. They're saying that 70% of women believe that their careers will be slowed down as a result of the pandemic. So not only is a physiological component playing out, the socioeconomics and what the pandemic's done to job security, etc., work pressures is adding to that. Now, if we take all these things and consider them from a strategic perspective, when we're looking at diversity and inclusion strategies, in your studies or in your research that you've done, what has supported the situation, Andrew?
Well, the truth is that most companies do not factor in PQ at the moment. Interestingly, we're just about to launch what we call the PQ Index, which will enable companies to benchmark themselves against key physiological measures within their workforce, rather in the way that they have with green issues, environmental issues and the like, because they're just not aware. And if you don't have benchmarks, organizations don't prioritize it. But the sort of things that need to be done is to recognize that most workplaces are made by men for men. That's just a historic hand-me-down. We just have to accept that. And if we accept that, then we must recognize that we must use science to understand what would be better and more inclusive for a workforce that is not just solely male. There are different ways of generating the same outcome. And so opening our eyes to the potential for more flexible working, for different forms of communication, even for different micromanagement techniques. I think most of us will recognize that many workplaces are excessively micromanaged, and transferring the responsibility for your own performance from your manager to yourself, so they coach you, but give you the resources to manage yourself optimally, may well open doors to much more creative solutions for making roles still attractive and attainable for women in a world that has been transformed by COVID, but also, frankly, being transformed by technology, AI, and the multidimensional aspects of our economic development. I don't think it's a simple process, but if you make it about doing what we've always done the way we've always done it, women are going to self-select out because they're realistic and they know it's an unreasonable ask from the organization. And we're picking up those metrics very clearly. And it's an alarming reality because it takes us to a place whereby employers have to recognize their responsibility for the 24-hour physiological well-being of their workforce, because they control so much of that working culture. You know, there's no point in saying it's not up to us. I'm your manager, but once you leave the office, I'm not the cause of your stress. Well, that's a nonsense, and we know that. And I think people have recognized that increasingly through their addiction to email and mobile technology. And now the working from home phenomenon has made it even more clear that work is deeply intrusive into your working and home life. And the truth is that we set a pattern, a physiological pattern on a profile, which is very powerfully influential of our home time. So we don't see an enormous difference between people's physiological stress profile during the working week and their weekends. Why? Because their bodies are in a habit.
Andrew, you know, there was an interesting survey that came out just this week by the research firm Ipsos, who reported that 51% of the surveyed respondents felt more stressed working from home, not because their companies asked them to do that, but because they felt obliged to be switched on, always on, for 24/7 and be available. What trends has your PQ research lifted over the last 18 months?
Right, that always on thing, it's interesting because our process doesn't just use technology to measure data, we also ask people to self-report. So we have a parallel picture. We have on the one hand your self-reported perception of the key metrics that we measure, and on the other we have the empirical scientific data. And the truth is that the average executive isn't very good at self-reporting. An elite athlete will be within 10% of assessing their physiological state at any given point. We've got some astonishing world champion data which shows up to 3 or 4% accuracy. We don't expect that from executives. It's a learned skill, and none of us have spent our lives really focusing on managing our physiology, and we haven't had the data to support our understanding of it. But our data showing people are between 20 and 35% inaccurate on a typical profile that we take. So not only is the self, and so engagement surveys, well-being surveys from companies need to come with a health warning that they're probably underestimating the issue anyway. On the specific issue of working from home, interestingly, we see different patterns. The stressors are not as simple as just the company's intruding into my life. Depends on your personality profile. If you're an extrovert, the absence of interpersonal contact in the way that you prefer is a stressor. Now, this medium is very uncomfortable to very physically relational individuals. Inversely, if you're an introvert, working from home can seem very, very enjoyable. You have the privacy to get on with the study that you particularly focus on. And we find some research analysts actively generate recovery while they are working because they love it so much. However, the process of introducing your boss into your living room or your study or your kitchen table via Zoom is very traumatic for an introvert. And the experience of being on a multi-split screen and being constantly visible to others is much more intrusive than being around a conference table where you can hide a little bit. So the truth is that there are many different dynamics, but at the root of it, the combination of technology and also the uncertainty, I think, has just raised average stress levels to the point whereby many people have found their mental health deteriorating and their perspective significantly adjusted.
Andrew, I want to pick up on three things that, we've discussed before, and I'd like to bring our listeners into it. And that is the kind of the transitions between focus, which one can do when you're in a specific workplace, creativity, which maybe is more available when you're in a space you're comfortable in, which may not necessarily be the office. And the third is finding your flow and integrating those three principles. So in the work you've done, in the research you've done, and in the executives that you've coached over the last year, how has that triangulation of focus, creativity, and flow supported effectiveness?
It's an interesting question. So focus, intensity of focus is something that we specifically measure alongside people's physiology. And what we find is that there is a correlation with a variety of measures, but one is particularly strong, and that is accumulated stress. We measure the residual stress that is unrecovered from the previous 24 hours as one of our 8 parameters. Now, accumulated stress is useless. It doesn't generate any performance, but physiologically it has the same impact as you having to do a presentation at a board meeting or going for a 5-mile run. Your body has to process it. So it effectively fills up your capacity to carry stress. And what we see is people who carry high levels of accumulated stress struggle to focus, particularly during the course of a hard-working week. They just have no elasticity in their capacity. And so that sort of brain fog feeling that people describe has a physiological root. The remedy is a combination of longer and more efficient sleep, more recovery-filled sleep, and also a practice of more active recovery during the daytime. If you want to focus, we measured a broadcaster live on British TV here, and she generated 90% peak stress. That's a really high level of focus and intensity, and you'd imagine, I'm hoping I'm somewhere close to that right now. But to prepare for that, she took 5 hours of daytime recovery 2 days before, and then had 10 hours of sleep straight afterwards. She recognized that these peaks don't get delivered without bookending with recovery. What we're finding in most executive workplaces is a grinding culture where everybody just grinds at about 70%. And if you're interested in peak performance, that is the antithesis. It'd be like asking an elite Olympic runner to run their event, their 400 meters, having run 10 miles straight before it. It just doesn't happen. You need to build in some elasticity into your working practices if you're going to generate real focus. So that's the focus piece. Creativity seems to be very correlated to sleep. We measured a very senior 60-plus-year-old investment banker whose job was advising the chief executives of major companies. And this individual, we as one of our metrics, we give people an ideal level of sleep duration given their profile. And this individual needed about 8.5 hours a night to be optimal physiologically. He managed that on 1 day. On 1 day, he also only slept for 4.5 hours. We were So his self-reporting on creativity was interesting because the day he slept 8 hours, he self-reported creativity at 80%. The day he slept 4.5 hours, 20%. Now, this was an experienced executive who knew himself. So clearly the message to him is, if you have inconveniently a very important client meeting the day after you slept only for 4 hours, your performance is going to be impaired unless you can generate some recovery, real recovery, during the period before you deliver that performance. It would be like the message you'd give to an elite athlete in resting before a Wimbledon final or whatever. I mean, we always say that if you go and knock on Tom Brady's door and he's lying on a sunbed, he's at work, or Ronaldo's door. They are working when they are recovering, because it's as determinant of their performance, their creativity, as the stress that they put in during the performance. And I think this is something that executives need to understand, that the world of macho, mental toughness, we're going to get through it just by strong wills. I can show you profiles of people who will crash and burn because they don't have this physiological platform to support that approach. And we're seeing it more and more. And when people talk about the mental health crisis, also what they're actually pointing the fingers at is a symptomatic problem of a physiologically measurable issue. So that's creativity.
A couple of things are going through my mind, and the one thing is about the culture in a workplace, and to what extent does that enable you to find your flow and optimize it? Because for all of us, our circadian rhythms are different. We peak at different times. We need different things. And our earlier subject about females in the workplace, I mean, over certain times of the month, if the female's a mom, there are various factors that come into it. Now, I guess to shape a more constructive workplace of the future and a creative one, we're going to need to start thinking very intentionally around our existing policies and how those can be adapted and made a little bit more flexible to allow people to be sovereign human beings. And that's a tough ask.
No, I don't think it is a tough ask, because I think data and science can help us. The things that prevent us from making steps forward is the fear of the unknown, the unquantifiable. So if someone can show you that the benefit will be reduced hours of stress and that links to higher creativity, if your objective is higher creativity, and I can show you a positive correlation of declining stress hours and rising creativity, then me as a manager, my thinking is, well, how do I reduce stress? Because I want that outcome. And if you can identify what the stressors are in your existing culture, I mean, personally, there are too many meetings. We have a culture of meetings partly because of the legacy of EQ as a key component of management. Communication has been prioritized. We now over-communicate. The truth is that we need to delegate much harder to create space for recovery. We need to have the confidence to give our delegates the opportunity to take the decisions in the meetings and the responsibility. And we need to do that because we value our recovery to deliver the more premium performance as something that should be baked in. When you talk about managing as sovereign individuals, absolutely. I mean, again, we can learn from elite sport. If I'm a sports coach, I can't control the outcome on the field. That is determined by my players, my athletes. So the point, and actually a lot of coaches are deeply disruptive if they start to try and get involved during the match. However, in management, we see very, very obsessive micromanagement practices in a lot of organizations because we've all been trained to think that micromanagement leads to superior outcomes. Well, if I can show you that it leads to high stress, maybe it doesn't lead to superior outcomes. It just leads to the outcomes that are available in a micromanagement environment. And that's not the same thing. I feel that there is an opportunity here for a very significant reshaping of the way we work based on optimal physiological environments as a factor. I'm not saying it's predominant. I'm not saying executives are athletes. One of the issues that we had when we started this company was that we were trying to measure too much detail. And executives' time is too precious. You can't ask them to give you their meal plans, take bloods from them, stick them in an MRI machine. It's too much. But if I stick a device on your chest for 7 days and I can establish a baseline of your profile and help you manage yourself and instruct those around you about why you are managing yourself that way, I think we're then moving to a much better place where generic culture gets replaced in a more stimulating, responsible working culture.
Andrew, as you know, our work at StratAstute Consulting does incorporate the principle of resilience in sustainable strategies and execution plans. But I have to admit that my context is shaped from me having spent many years in the healthcare and pharmaceutical sector. In other sectors, the link between good health and wellness and sustainable business strategies is not that tangible. So for the C-suites who are listening into our conversation today and who resonate, Andrew, with what you're saying, where does one start with the strategy in the workplace?
You start where you always should start, with measurement. You've got to have a proper diagnostic. There's a lot of well-being, solutions which are being sold as panaceas without the legwork being done first. There's no point in putting in resources until you know what you're managing. And to do that, you need to measure. And you need to measure to a level of scientific accuracy, which can mean that it's worthwhile making those necessary changes. So our fundamental proposition is get a proper metric framework of what your physiological environment and culture is. And then when you see what it is, rather than making value judgments, start trying working out, is that what you want? I mean, I had a very senior executive said to me just a couple of weeks ago, so 18 hours of stress in a 24-hour period is not really sustainable for me, is it? And I said, well, that's not for me to say. You may be a superhuman, but it may be that you are on a path which will severely constrain your ability to both receive promotions or sustain the position you're in, because 18 hours a day is a hell of a lot for anybody to take. And I think for your C-suite clients listening, frankly, this is an uncomfortable conversation because most of you will know nothing about physiology and you like being in control and you like to be the expert in the room. Well, this is one of those times when you're just going to have to listen and you're going to have to look at evidence and you're going to have to seek expertise. But very quickly, it starts to make sense. These aren't very complicated concepts, but they aren't familiar in the workplace. And then the second thing is, it's a long haul. This is not about saying, well, we're going to change everything by reducing our stress by 20%. Most high-performing environments have people who are predisposed towards stress. They just are. The people who respond to emails quickly, make quick decisions, have a high stress response. So the more sophisticated question is, if I have people who are predisposed to stress and they're high performing, how do I maintain their high performance but build in their resilience? That's the goal. That's where you see in elite sport extending careers so much. And the truth is, the answer is to offer them the resources to make good decisions themselves. If they're smart people and they're interested in their performance, they will make good decisions, but give them a framework of understanding that helps them. Now, the other side of this, the risk side for your C-suite, is that we do have a precedent for ignoring physiological risk in the workplace. The concussion crisis in American football, rugby union, rugby league, and soccer is an ongoing crisis which has had huge financial impact, balance sheet impact. The NFL paid out $5 billion, having denied any link between its rules, coaching practices, and performance requirements over a lengthy period. And they've changed the nature of the game and the concussion protocols, and that's continuing. That is continuing in rugby right now, and it's already leading to a dramatic change in the approach to heading a soccer ball. I believe that stress, fatigue, burnout, the outcomes of a high-performance executive workplace are analogous with concussion. So I'm saying to the C-suites, you need to understand this. You need to measure it. It may tell you some uncomfortable messages, and yes, you will need to change. But the truth is that elite sport has survived very well by adjusting to learning to change. And I think this is the way we will go as well. Performance will enhance, but you need to embrace the fact that some things that you may consider to be non-negotiable will have to change.
I think, Andrew, and I want to get into just now how this would work practically, should people be interested in contacting you for this. But the time has possibly come now with what we've experienced in the last 18 months. Health has become top priority in everyone's minds at the moment. And I think people are also that much more aware now about good nutrition, good sleep patterns, what they need to do to boost their immunity. And also we've got the devices and technology now to help us measure these things. And perhaps this is the time to look at these types of strategies more intentionally. But where many businesses are now at the moment, it's this focus on survival before the recovery comes. So let me play devil's advocate, because there are many business leaders who may well respond by saying that they're not investing something that is a public sector responsibility, generally speaking, of course. And, we've yet to see courageous or intentional shift in corporate leadership to invest in building what I call SQ, or social capital. Why should organizational leaders, Andrew, be investing in PQ and not rather leaving it to the healthcare systems? What is the real return on investment, if we can call it that?
Okay, well, I'll just give you an example. Take a very big company, JP Morgan Chase. In their last fiscal year, they spent $40 billion in compensation for their workforce. Their human capital cost them $40 billion to keep in situ. That was 3 times more than the money they spent on real estate maintenance, real estate, and technology infrastructure. So the statement and I can assure you that the CFO knows a hell of a lot more about the insurance policies and the maintenance and servicing programs on their real estate and their technology than they do about the equivalent for their human capital. Quite simply, companies do not know enough about the human beings that they employ. And I think this is important as well from a future investment ROI perspective, because human beings are now in competition with AI. We have to accept that. And for human beings to add sufficient value to justify their existence relative to a machine, they need to maximize their potential. And right now, we know at a micro level that excessive alcohol consumption, inflammatory nutritional dietary indiscipline, poor sleep habits, lack of exercise have a cumulative effect on the energy levels of human beings and their capacity to perform, let alone the deeper cognitive and emotional decision-making capacity that we're interested in. So my message is, sure, you can leave it to the government, but the government is actually funding the post-symptomatic remedies of behaviors that are deeply damaged. And I think we need to recognize that we're in a society which has been corrupted by an ugly dietary regime of hyper-processed cheap food, which has damaged the health of millions of people. And there's no visible way out of that, because there's a sort of a tax spend relationship with the government, which is very difficult to break. So the only way to break it is through habit and individual responsibility. And if I'm employing a very valuable human resource, and I've invested in training them, and they have the potential to do a great job, but their lifestyle is getting in the way of that, I think as an employer, it makes sense for me to intervene and to offer the resources and the nudge that is necessary. And one of the things that we find in debriefing individuals is that they can't walk away from what the device tells them. We show them what they think the narrative is, and then we show them what the reality is. And then they can choose. But we also show them themselves benchmarked against their peers. And the relative disadvantage is a concern for someone in a competitive marketplace. So yeah, I think for your devil's advocate, you can leave it to the government. You can leave everything to the government. But I think if you're in the business of competing for talent and for competing against the machines, and if you're in the business of creativity and focus, and you use the word flow, we probably use the word energy. If you want an energetic organization, PQ is right at the center of that.
Andrew, so let's unpack how this works practically. An organization or leaders listening in on this may be interested in applying this in their own spaces. How would they go about it, and how does the process work?
The process we've found in most organizations is we take a pilot group of around 10 executives, and mostly they are senior executives. It could be an executive leadership group, and each one of them gets sent a heart rate variability device. We onboard them, we show them how they wear it, we give them access to our 3Q platform for the self-reporting diaries, and we measure them for a week. They send us the device back, we analyze the data, we generate what we call a PQ profile report, which is the baseline report that shows you all of the key metrics and your benchmark against peer groups. And then we give a 1-hour executive debriefing of the key measures, the key recommendations and analysis. And then we aggregate that data for the company at a different level to give them a corporate culture health check as well. So we tell you what your aggregate profile looks like. And we can tell you total hours. I mean, an organization very recently did the group we measured had more than 96 hours of measurable stress every 7 days. That's compared to about 45 hours of recovery. And we then dig into whether that is necessary for the performance and what alternatives are available. We can dig into demographics, that can be gender, we can look into age differentials. So once we have the data, the potential to bake the PQ perspective into the organizational's management approach to well-being performance becomes much more obvious. For the individuals, our platform can be continued to be used. Its technology is used by 550 pro US sports teams and college athletic programs. It's designed for individual athletes. It's GDPR compliant, completely robust. Actually, the Cleveland Clinic also uses it for health usage. And this platform can take a feed from your Apple Watch, your Whoop band, your Oura Ring. You can start managing your data on a consistent basis. We have self-reported diaries for burnout, for mental strength, for working parents. You can vary your self-reporting diary. You can take in your personal training program. We can also link it up into an organizational's KPIs and run performance metrics alongside the physiological data and the self-reported data. So there's a lot packed into this. It's digital, it's forward-looking, but it also creates a framework of understanding for both the individual to take personal responsibility and for the organization to understand the context. But to make it very clear, the company never sees the individual's data. That is private and it's for them alone. And that's consistent with most coaching practices anyway of the need for that privacy protection. And we work with executive coaches, we work with management consultancies, who are looking to bake PQ, as you are, into those metrics, those physiometrics and those perspectives into the way they put an overarching analysis and analytic into a company. So we want to be useful for a company, but we also want to be useful for their preferred service providers.
Thank you, Andrew, for that. And what are some of the indicators within PQ that you would measure?
Right, so we measure stress hours, daytime and nighttime. We measure recovery hours, daytime and nighttime. As I said, we measure accumulated stress, the residual stress. We measure resilience with what we call the recharge level, which is the initial recharge every morning, how much you've recharged your batteries. And interestingly, the average on our executive database at the moment is 65%. So people are only coming into the office 65% recharged on an average basis. We measure 3 performance metrics. General stress, which is the average level of stress your body will allow you to take. Interestingly, we self-regulate. Secondly, peak stress, that maximum level of effort that you can generate. And then finally, what we call activity strain, which is overall volume of stress, load. And then we measure recovery, 3 recovery parameters. One is the daytime recovery stress ratio, how much daytime recovery you're actually factoring in. Executives are terrible at that. The average is 1.3 hours a day. When you consider that includes weekends and every meal time, that's a shocking data point. 80% of the executives we measure generate 0 recovery during meal times. This is an importation of US dining habits. There's an interesting data point that a survey found that the average American has an hour sitting at a dining table, or has an hour eating their meals per day, whereas in France it's 2.5 hours. There's a cultural shift here, and sure, it's productive to have people sitting at a screen and eating carbohydrate and drinking caffeine and sugary caffeine at their desks, but cumulatively you're eroding their capacity to be resilient. And then the final measure we have is 24-hour recovery, which is the volume of recovery, and then sleep quality. And sleep quality is not duration, and it's not deep and light sleep and what the apps give you. What we measure is duration blended with performance, your ability to generate recovery when you're asleep. Otherwise, it's useless. And then thirdly, the volume of recovery. And within that pack of 8 parameters, you get a very powerful statement of an individual's capacity. And then separately, a new product we've just developed and about to launch, the PQ Index, which is for boards, corporates, to benchmark themselves against. So rather like some of the environmental indices and the like, which have been, and sustainability indices that have been baked into the investment process for investors and the self-management process and governance process in companies, we've developed a PQ index to give a company a very quick diagnostic of where they stand and where they might want to shift their numbers.
Andrew, that's excellent. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing that when it's launched, because when we talk about responsible and responsive leadership, one cannot do that when you are unrecuperated or you're not feeling your best self. Then you tend to become reactive, right? And that doesn't do much for building social capital. So I absolutely see how this fits with the ESG strategy around the S component. I mean, when we talk about risk management and sustainability programs, there's a high focus on the E, which is environmental, a little bit on the governance, but the S, there's so much to it that one can unpack. And with what we need to start considering now when it looks forward to build better strategies, it starts with recovery and building resilience around the people in the organization, in our society, right? So this index, what triggered that idea, and how do you see it being applied? Because it sounds like it could be hugely impactful.
Yeah, it comes from a variety of areas, but we were trying to link senior management decision making with the data that we were seeing on the ground. And we began with the process, well, they'll want to measure themselves because they'll want to, senior managers will want to know what their physiology is. And we found that that was a false presumption. People like the sound of it, but they're too busy or they feel a little uncomfortable or whatever it may be. And we found some people have been reluctant to proceed. And it's one of those things. Senior managers are very good at saying, great idea, we'll do it somewhere down the organizational chain as a pilot. So that's where we found our pilots. But we feel that the urgency is there because the evidence is there. I mean, for instance, there's been a lot of coverage of Goldman Sachs junior bankers being forced to work very long hours. Now, if you play that back, as an investor in investment banks, if I want to benchmark Goldman Sachs with 3 or 4 other investment banks, the solidity of their future earnings streams is the sustainability of them retaining that talent and the sustainability of that talent in place. So it makes sense to ask the question, how does that look physiologically? Does that look does that process, maybe they're right. I mean, my argument to Goldman Sachs is we'd love to come and measure your junior bankers because you may be identifying people who can work that hard and that's a sustainable strategy. Or is in fact your strategy, burn them out and replace them like batteries? Because that's a different story and that may create for investors a different response as to whether they want to be investors in that culture. So that benchmark is something that we're encouraging investors to consider very hard. Do you want to know how it is that the human capital in the companies that you invest in generate the returns that you see? And we've already seen that already in the abuse of third world suppliers into the apparel industry and how shocking that was and how eventually we've had some cultural change. But the truth is that our data is showing that unknowingly, we don't attribute blame, but unknowingly organizations have highly discriminatory consequences to the corporate culture, performance culture that they've evolved. And as I said, primarily, that culture is masculine. And it's simple stuff. The temperature in the average corporate HQ is set to a temperature that is most comfortable for men relative to women. Just a fact. Why? Because that temperature was set primarily by men. There's no blame attached, but we've moved on, and a lot of our physiological data management just hasn't. So yeah, we believe the index is going to help decision makers allocate capital and allocate resources around their human, basically determinants, the human capacity, which is so important to their returns on equity and returns on investment, and say, we need to know more about them, and we need to be honest about the distinctions between genders, and we need to be honest about some factors that we didn't used to consider important in the performance of those human beings. We didn't think it was our responsibility. Well, our argument is that it probably is demonstrably the case that you are, as the employer, the primary determinant of most of your workers' physiological responses.
Andrew, best wishes for the launch of that index, and please do keep us posted. So we're at the end of 2021 almost, and fast forward 10 years, Andrew, to 2032. What impact do you wish to achieve through your, what you call your PQ evangelism?
Right. I want PQ to be considered in every important decision in the corporate landscape. It may be a low level importance, but it's a factor that should be considered. I want managers educated and informed, and I want workers responsible and resourced. So that means they need the technology, and we need a culture of honesty around physiology so that the best outcomes for the greatest number are possible. I believe that we will be talking about physiology with increasing intensity over the next 10 years. I think by the time you're talking about, it will seem absurd to any manager to employ someone or to promote them without considering the physiological context of that decision. I think it will be seen as crazy as some of the sort of, as making a landline telephone call or choosing to send a written letter relative to an email. These things are nice and have a cultural place, but some practices are just going to seem very redundant. And the other thing is, in 2032, there will be many, many, many more female leaders right across the workplace at every level, and they will be stronger and they will be more self-motivated because PQ will be part of the culture that they're involved in, and that will be a huge and inclusive factor without any question, because women are much more physiologically aware and responsible than men already, and it's an area of inclusion, psychological inclusion, that is completely neglected in the workplace, and I think it will have a transformative effect.
Andrew, I think that's a brilliant point to stop our conversation on today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with myself and the listeners. And I'm sure that we'll continue our conversation to engage on these potential ideas and also share them with clients who've been listening in today and who are interested in taking this forward in their organization. So Lift as We Rise aims to influence better build business strategies, and our conversation today could support your ESG sustainability strategy, looking at SDG 3, which talks about good health and well-being, to enable SDG 8, which talks about decent work and economic growth. So if you are ready to discuss how PQ can fit as a strategy into your business or leadership journey, please get in touch via the website www.stratastute.co.za. You can also email admin@stratastute.co.za. Alternatively, you can find myself and Andrew on LinkedIn using the hashtag StratConnect. Andrew, do you have contact details for our listeners?
Yes, the best thing is to email me directly, andrew.macdonald@pq/perform.com. Our website is currently under redesign. I am at LinkedIn, and PQ is also on LinkedIn. Please join me on those. The website will relaunch with the PQ Index, etc., quite soon. But in the meantime, just email me directly or get in contact through Roshni. As I say, we'll be working together. There's a lot to be done, and the truth is that we're all just lifting up pebbles on a beach at the moment. The more people engage in this and raise the issues, the more motivated we are.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Andrew. Before we end, thank you to Mobi Learn Africa, our tech partner, who are committed to assist citizenry in unlocking the full potential of smartphones and other mobile devices. Join me again in the first week of November for our next conversation. Until then, remember, lift as we rise so that together we shall thrive. We'll see you again. Bye-bye.